This is the combined chapters 7 and 9, the Industrial Revolution. This is discussion number 2, getting jobs in the cities. The farmers of the early Industrial Revolution got squeezed out of the growing opportunities of being a farmer by what's referred to as the enclosure movement. See, what had happened all through history up until this point is that people who had cattle or other livestock would essentially let their cattle roam around in the meadows around the town. Everyone know pretty much whose animals belong to whom, and then when time came for their use, that's what it was. However, due to a lot of the farmers drastically increasing their productivity, they started essentially maybe overgrazing areas, and there may have been disputes over uh, appropriate use of the land. It could be for whatever reason that they started the enclosure movement, where you had to have your own private land for your animals to graze, and that became a financial problem for the poor farmers who couldn't afford extra cash layouts in order to sustain their cattle, because they couldn't buy it to make it exclusively theirs. So they would end up selling to the large farming operations, or the noblemen who had control and had the money to kind of buy them out. And then the farmers were like, well, what do we do with ourselves now? And so they would end up moving into the cities looking for work, since they couldn't sustain their families in the local villages. So as people moved to factories, because that's where it looked like jobs could be, the factories started being built with reckless abandon. And we saw that a lot of environmental damage occurred as people were building machines and not really worrying about the tremendous amount of soot that came out of the coal burning factories, or the other environmental difficulties or runoffs into the water supplies that made the Industrial Revolution so difficult for a lot of the populations of the Industrial Revolution. On top of that, the workers were not exactly having a good place to live. So factory workers, factories trying to encourage workers to come work for them, would build houses for them, which were called tenements, multi-leveled houses divided into apartments. Very little sanitation, so everyone had to use the same outhouse, or uh, the air didn't go very well. So essentially, if one person got sick, they all got sick. And so the tenements, while seemed to be a perk, it would be better than perhaps living out in the woods, but it was not an easy place to live. Some of the tenements actually lived in shifts, so if you had uh, a place to sleep, you might have had 8 hours rights to that location, and then you work the other 16 or 12 hours, or it might have been 12 on, 12 off, and that someone else used that room that you slept in or whatever while you were working, and it was a trade off. So the tenements, again, were built by the factory owners to get the workers there and to keep them close to where they were working. Now, another thing of the Industrial Revolution is that children were heavily involved. Now, when you're talking the old time ancient labor of working the oxen, yeah, children weren't very needed a lot of strength in order to be productive. But the machines do all the work. You just got to make sure all the moving parts keep going. And so children were heavily used the Industrial Revolution, especially in mining, because they're short. So they would fit into smaller areas in the mines as they're getting the coal that would then be burned to run the factories. Children, sometimes as young as 5, would be working in the mines, getting coal and making money for the family in order to get their basic needs. The work days would be 12 to 16 hours, working 6 or 7 days out of the week. And for the most part, while men did tend to be more productive in these heavy labor jobs in the mines, a lot of times children and women were preferred employees during or in the factories because they didn't have to be paid as much as men. They didn't demand as much pay, and so it was less expensive to employ them. On top of that, a lot of these machines have huge working parts, and there wasn't a lot of extra space for people to get in and fix them. And so sometimes children's were the preferred employees because their small hands could get into these small spaces in order to repair the machines. And keep in mind that because we're keeping the machines going all the time, they didn't stop the machines when the children were sticking their hands into places trying to fix things, and sometimes their hands and feet would get stuck in them and then they'd lose them. So we have lots of, whereas we think of it today as horrible working conditions, and no one should have had to work in these conditions back then, but they didn't know any better. They've never had these experiences before, and there's going to be a movement of thinking in the society to evaluate what we really ought to do with these people who work in the factories, and there's going to be a movement to increase their rights and their safety. In fact, a lot of the workers would work together trying to force owners to for better pay, better conditions, better hours, and they formed mutual aid societies to help each other, or they'd form unions and work united as trying to get the factory owners to improve the conditions. Unions were advocated by a guy by the name of Robert Owen for all the workers to essentially stop at one time and say, improve the conditions or we all go. The unions fought against one of the largest health problems during the early Industrial Revolution was the textile mills had lint just filling the air that everyone was breathing, and essentially got in their lungs and gave them emphysema and other types of of breathing problems because of the lint that they all breathed in. And that was one of the early ideas that got the factory owners to help the situations of their employees so that they continue. Concludes discussion number 2, Getting Jobs in the Cities. It is part of the combined chapters of 7 and 9, The Industrial Revolution.